Thank you so much, Natalie. Hello, everyone. So good to be here with you tonight. I'm in Calgary, my home, or the place that was known as Mohkinstsis. Um, I'm really particularly pleased to be here because I have had the chance to visit the White Museum a few times. And one of the first people I remember meeting in the literary community when Pourin Down Rain was first published 30 years ago was John White. He was a very welcoming, friendly person. I recall feeling quite shy. I was pretty young and new to the scene, and it was just very nice to be welcomed by him into the literary community as I was. So it's very nice to be here. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. I have a cough, ongoing, um, chronic cough, so you don't have to worry about me if I start coughing. I'm not ill, but I have a lozenge going and I've got lots of water, so hopefully I'll be okay. And I have some notes here and I'm going to do my best to stick to them so that I don't end up running over time. I want to make sure to leave some time for your questions at the end. I am going to share my screen. And I hope everyone can see that. Can somebody send me a quick note in the chat just to let me know you can see? All right, I'm going to proceed. I'm sure Natalie will let me know if anything goes awry with my slides. So I'm going to start this book talk with a brief introduction to the history of my family and how we got here, because it pertains not only to Pouring Down Rain and the writing of it, but to all my work, actually. And I'm hoping that at the end of the evening, you'll come away with a bit of an understanding of the connections between my work and why I do what I do. This is a photograph of my great-grandfather, Willie Glover, holding me shortly after I was born. And I like to share this photo because it's a reminder for me of how close we are generationally to the enslavement of people of African descent in Canada, the US, parts of South America, and the Caribbean. Because I think we can think of history as something that is so far away in the past that it has no bearing on who we are in the world today. But if you look at this photo of me with my great grandfather, you will see that. Now, I should say this great grandfather was not enslaved. Willie Glover was not enslaved. He was born after emancipation. But my other great grandfather, Rufus Smith, who is the shorter man you see in the middle in this photograph, was enslaved. So my grandfather, who I knew very well and loved deeply, was raised by this man who had been enslaved. My mother, of course, was raised by my grandfather, and I, being raised by my mother and having known my grandfather so well, am not very far removed from that aspect of history. So I'm sure you've heard the saying that the past is not the past, history is not the past. History matters because it impacts on the lives of people with whom we interact on a daily basis in our modern lives, in our contemporary lives. My great grandfathers and great grandmothers, Willie and Katie Glover, and Rufus and Drusilla Smith, came to Western Canada as part of what is known as the Black Migration of 1910 to the prairies. So people from the southern US, from many from Oklahoma, some from Kansas, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, many other places, came to this part of the world because they were being brutalized in the places where they were living. And I'm not going to go into that history today because I don't feel that I have time to honor the brutality of the experiences they were having. And at the same time, the Canadian government was advertising for American farmers to come to the prairie provinces. It was part of their colonial project to displace Indigenous people and have the land settled upon by settlers. And they were not expecting that there were Black people who would be reading those same advertisements in Southern newspapers, who were afraid for their lives, afraid for their futures, for the things that they had assembled to live upon, their crops, their cattle, their buildings, their homes. All of those things were under threat. And the Canadian government didn't think that there would be any connection in the minds of Black people to this message that they were sending out, that the Black people saw as a message of hope. So that's a little bit of the history of why they came. Just going to go to the next slide. When they came, they built, usually as the first order of business, churches. So this is a slide of the church. It's known as the Church of the Shiloh people of the Eldon district in northern Saskatchewan. It's quite close to Maidstone. And this would have been the building that my great-grandparents helped to build very shortly after they arrived. The building is still standing thanks to the work of Leander Lane, who is also a descendant of this migration, and it has recently been declared a provincial historic site in Saskatchewan. So it does have some protection in that regard. It was kind of pulled together, not renovated, but restored using the same materials that the original people used. They created 5 small Black communities. My great-grandparents happened to go to the Saskatchewan side where there was just the one. But excuse me, in Alberta, there were 4 small Black communities created by this migration, the best known of which is Amber Valley, Alberta. And that's about 30 miles or so east of Athabasca. There is also a community at Campsie, Alberta, Breton, what was known as Keystone at that time, and Wildwood, or what was known as Junkins at that time. When they got to the border, unfortunately, they did not find the welcome that they were expecting. They had heard of Canada for more than a century, being sung about in the spirituals. That is a body of music that was created by by enslaved Africans that held secrets and codes and hopes and fears and joys. The music embodied all of that. And part of the secrets and the codes in the language was referring to escape to the north, and sometimes specifically to Canada. So the reception that they received upon coming to the border was not what they were expecting. And it was a very harsh, rude awakening, because most of them had pulled up all of their stakes. They had relocated their families. They had sold what they could and piled everything else onto wagons and onto trains and come a very, very long way from where they had been living. So it was a very upsetting reception that they received at the border. This is an image of a letter drawn up by Wilfrid Laurier's government of the time in 1911 in response to the outcry against the arrival of this group of people, basically an order in council that was intended to ban Black migration into Western Canada. It was not enacted into law because it became clear that it wasn't necessary to do so. Other methods that they had devised to keep people from coming or to keep people from successfully crossing the border were put into place, and those actions were successful in quelling this migration. So the dream that my ancestors and the approximately 1,500 other Black people who did come at that time to create a really thriving and successful Black presence in the northern prairies was not to be. So as a response to the poor reception that they received, people had to do their best in the circumstances that they were given. So they built churches, as I said earlier, and they eventually started businesses of their own, like the Chicken Fry restaurant in Calgary. There was also the Chicken Inn in Calgary, and there was Hattie's Southern Chicken Inn, I think, in Edmonton. All of the small communities had these little businesses that were a really important community hub, provided employment for many of the women in the community who worked there as cooks and servers, and it provided a safe and welcoming place for Black porters to come and eat when they came through the cities, because often they were refused admission to other restaurants. So the people that you see in this photograph were people, for the most part, people who I knew as a very young person when I was growing up in Calgary. And many of the people in the community became what I refer to as living libraries. So the man on my left, I did not know well. I only met a couple of times. His name was Bing Jones. But everyone else in this photograph was someone that was very dear to me. And more than being dear to me, people who were willing to share the stories of their lives and their past and their experiences. There were people who invested time, money, energy, and all kinds of love into my life and the lives of the other young people of our community. So in this photo, there's Mr. Napoleon Sneed standing beside the groom. The groom is my uncle, Andrew Risby, who was a minister in Calgary for more than 50 years. And his wife was Edith Smith Risby. Edith was one of my mother's older sisters. And beside the bride is her older sister, Ethel Smith Lucy. And beside Aunt Ethel is Mr. Crump, Mr. Melvin Crump, who was quite a well-known musician in Calgary when I was a youngster. And sitting below him is my mom. And on the other side, the other flower girl is my Aunt Pearl, my mom's twin sister. I began to be interested in the stories that I heard these people telling at a very early age, and often found myself sitting at their feet. This is another person in the community who was from Amber Valley. She was born in and grew up in Amber Valley, and who was one of the best friends of my mom and my mom's twin sister, Pearl. We often call them the three Ps, Peggy, Pearl, and Pauline. And she as well has always been an incredible resource and support for me in my working life as a writer. I became interested in the story of this migration because I didn't see it represented in the society in which I lived. I didn't see it in any library books. I didn't see it in any lessons at school. And I began to be curious about the story for my own sake. As I said, when I would hear people talking about their lives, their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents. And I began to wonder, how did my grandpa, who you see standing on the edge of this photograph, how did he go from being the son of a person who was enslaved in Texas, who eventually ran away from enslavement with nothing but some onions in his pocket? I'm referring to my great-grandfather, Rufus Smith. How did my grandpa go from being the son of that person to this landscape, to this snowy landscape with my grandma at his side and two of his sisters who were visiting them at their home in Regina at that time, at the time that this photograph was taken? I found that fascinating, and such a very long and winding and dangerous journey. And when I considered that I have lived in the same quadrant of the same city for my entire life, I think about the relative safety of my life. I think about the sacrifices and the experiences that people went through. And I think you can gather from there why I became interested in the story. One day I was visiting with my grandparents in Winnipeg at their home, and I began to ask questions. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to read Pourin Down Rain yet. I know some of you have for sure. I saw that John and Betty are in the audience, and I know that they have read Pourin Down Rain. And so I just thought this was an interesting scrap to share, because it's the genesis of the book Pourin Down Rain. It was the bridge between wanting to know and wanting to write. As I said, I didn't see this story in books. I was an avid reader, and I began to want to see the story in books. And I came to realize that if that was going to happen, it was probably going to have to be me. So I remember distinctly this day, and all I had in my purse was this scrap of an envelope, which I took and just was scribbling down the stories that they were sharing as we were sitting in their Winnipeg living room. I started out on that journey of wanting to tell this story by writing an article for Calgary Magazine that was under the editorship of a woman named Penny Williams at that time. And I think back with gratitude for Penny Williams. I'm not sure if I ever would have been able to realize my ambition of becoming a writer if I hadn't happened upon such a wonderful editor who was so interested in this story and who recognized the importance of it from early on. I very shyly sent a note saying, I've never been published, but I'm interested in writing. Here are some story ideas I have. And I submitted several. And the very last one I said was, or, perhaps you might be interested in knowing a bit about Calgary's Black community. And she wrote back immediately and said, that's the one, that's the story. And of course, I'm interested in it. So I got the opportunity to go around and talk with the ancestors, not just the ancestors, but other people of African descent who were living in Calgary at the time, whose families had come more recently, some in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And I remember going to Aunt Gotchi's house. This is a woman you saw in a previous photograph, in the photograph of the chicken fry. It was her sister that started that restaurant, and she was one of the people that worked in it sometimes. She was a phenomenal cook, as so many of the women from the community were. And I recall going to her home, where I sat with her and Uncle Knapp at their kitchen table. Uncle Knapp was not my blood uncle, but just I called everybody in the community aunt and uncle. You also saw him in a previous photo, in the wedding photo. He was one of the groomsmen. And Aunt Gotchi had made cinnamon buns that day. And we had coffee and cinnamon buns, and we laughed, and they shared stories. They were loving and open and honest and deeply touched that I had taken the time to come over and talk with them that day, and that I viewed this story as one that should be known, should be better known. It was a wonderful day, and it was my introduction to what a person's life as a writer could be like. I'll always cherish the memories of driving away that day and thinking, this could be my life. This sweet moment that I've had of talking to people and eating cinnamon buns could be my life. At the time, I was working as a dental assistant. So I was very, it was a baptism into a life that was a beautiful moment and was a real inspiration for me moving forward. If you have read Pouring Down Rain, you've met Aunt Daisy, my great aunt, one of my grandfather George's younger sisters. So she was one of the children of Drusilla and Rufus Smith. This is a photograph of her taken at their home in Saskatchewan, and I just love it. I just, of course, I only knew Aunt Daisy as an old woman, and I absolutely love this photo of her as a young woman on the farm with one of her kids, and you can see my great-grandmother Drusilla in the background there if you look closely. Aunt Daisy was incredibly seminal to the development of Pourin Down Rain. When I went to talk to her in Edmonton, and drove up to Edmonton to record some of her stories, to take my tape recorder and talk with her, I discovered that she had written our story down already, a great deal of it, by hand. As you can see, this is her handwriting, and this is an excerpt from what she wrote at that time. And I know that her commitment to writing down the story of her father and her mother's lives and her grandfather and great-grandparents' lives, it would not have lived on if it wasn't for Aunt Daisy taking the time to do this. And I just wanted to read a little bit about from that excerpt, because she describes a time similar to the time I described with my grandparents in their Winnipeg home. This was her with her parents in Saskatchewan. So that at home with my mother and father, I had learned more about their lives than I had ever known before. Maybe it was meant to be that I should know the story behind their lives, that I might relate to my own children, that it would not be lost to those that come after us. I honor her and I thank her, and I hope she would feel that I have done justice to the story, that she did not want to be lost to those who came after. So it was quite difficult to get the original edition of Pouring Down Rain published. I was a pretty inexperienced writer. I had written a few articles for Calgary magazine by that time, and I thought it was time to embark on the writing of this story. But it was a very different time, and I received some discouraging responses to the manuscript, including one from a publisher who said there are not enough Black people in Canada for us to justify publishing your work. And that was just such a terrible thing to say on so many levels. Of course, it was crushing, and I am grateful that I stood upon the shoulders of my ancestors and knew that that was wrong, and knew that the story did matter. And I persevered and found a publisher in Calgary, that Selig Enterprises, that was run by a man by the name of Ted Giles. And as I go through this presentation, I just want to acknowledge all the people who supported me along the way. All the people, if you took any one of those people away or out of this story, my life as a writer may never have happened. So I also like to honor Ted Giles. I wanted to write stories that I thought it was important for Canadians to know. But I also wanted to write stories that I would have wanted when I was a child. As I said, I read voraciously. I never read a book with a positive representation of Black people in my life until I was 21. I simply did not have access to books that had people like me in them until I was a young adult. The only book that had a Black person on the cover that was in either my school or my local community library was Little Black Sambo. And if any of you have ever seen that book, you know how horrific an experience that was to have that be the only book. So I after Pouring Down Rain was published, I did some other things. I started getting interested in writing in other forms. And one of those was to write a book that I would have wanted to read when I was a young girl. So I wrote One Thing That's True as my first young adult novel. I followed it up a few years later with a book that I wanted to write because I had children who are mixed race, and I wanted them to have a book that looked like them or that represented an experience that they might have had, or at least people who, like they, are from a multitude of backgrounds. And that's why I started writing I Have Been in Danger. And then from there, I went on to want to write a children's story with a male protagonist. And I was coming around the corner of my house one day, and I looked down the street, and this child who was featured in the story, it was like I saw him sitting on the front step of my home. So Dear Baobab came out of that experience of rounding the corner, seeing in my mind Maiko, the boy in this book, on my stoop, and realizing that the time had come to write a story for young Black boys and girls. I started doing a lot of writing for magazines, and more I discovered that people were in fact interested in this story. So this story that I wrote for Legacy magazine, you can see I'm holding a photograph of my grandparents there, and I have drawings that my mother had restored of my great-grandparents behind me, sort of blurred out in the background. I began to recognize some of the pitfalls of writing about a story that was so close to my heart, including that you're telling stories that are other people's stories as well. And that's challenging as a writer, because I'm not the type of writer who doesn't care about that. Some writers don't worry about it. They don't worry about what people are going to think, or what family members or close people are going to think. But I do think about that. And I do want to honor people's lives. And I don't feel it's my place to spill any painful elements of their lives that they're not interested in sharing. So at the time that this piece came out, I was sort of dealing with some of those types of challenges in the kind of work that I do. This is a brief excerpt from a text thread from my brothers and I after a special about the album What's Going On by Marvin Gaye came out. And we had a very long exchange over text about how much that album had meant to us. And I started to think about all the influences that there have been on my work, the music, the people, the reading of works that didn't reflect my life, but that I felt connected to anyway. And that helped me to understand the power of writing. And I wanted to harness some of that power and sense of connection for readers of my work. So just sharing this to share a little bit about how deeply we were we were impacted by the work of other Black artists and how important music is to my own work. I listen to music every day. I always listen to music when I'm working. And that music that is so much a part of my heritage, my history, my culture, my growing up years in Calgary comes out through my work all the time. Recently, actually, I did a presentation with my daughter Miranda about the place of spirituals in not only my life, but in the lives of my younger generations, my own kids, my nieces and nephews, my grandchildren, my great nieces and great nephews. I also want to acknowledge, as I'm going through my life and talking about my career, I'm just going to look at the time here to make sure I'll have time for questions. I met my husband, Clem Martini, who is also a writer, when we were in grade 7. And I also believe, in addition to all of those things that had to come together in my past to encourage me to be a writer, to recognize the importance of this story, I have to recognize the influence of Clem in my life. He was the only other person in my grade 7 class who talked about becoming a writer. I had never really shared that with any friends prior to meeting him because I thought it would be laughed about. We were both poor children from poor families in a poor neighborhood. Nobody in our community was a writer. It seemed almost like a laughable aspiration to have. But meeting him made me start to think that it was possible. He believed so strongly that we could become writers one day that I started to believe it too. We were very close friends. We weren't dating when we were 12. We actually didn't start dating until we were 23, but we ultimately shared a life as writers through our friendship before we began to think of sharing our entire lives together. And I'm just going to, I've shared this excerpt from one of Clem's books that is called The Blunt Playwright, in which he talks about how much of a commitment you have to make to your writing and how much you have to believe in yourself as a writer, to celebrate your art and challenge the notion that writing is frivolous, that art is a hobby, that paying attention to story is a self-indulgence. So just a little tribute to Clem, as well as one of the very important pieces of my development as a writer. I went from writing books to being interested in other forms, including writing for the theater eventually. And I wrote a play called Heaven 20 years ago that was produced at Lunchbox Theater. And just as Pourin Down Rain has received a 30th anniversary edition, Heaven is also receiving a 20th anniversary remount, they call it in the theater world, or we call it in the theater world. So for those of you who are in Calgary or area, this is a play that you can see later this summer. It's set in a fictionalized Amber Valley about a fictionalized school teacher who comes from the East to teach in Amber Valley, and a fictionalized Amber Valley baseball team. The Amber Valley baseball team in reality was a very famous Northern Alberta baseball team, and it was a pleasure and an honor to write about the community in this work. And I'm really happy that it's getting more productions as we go along. As some of you may know, I also started working in television and film as a result of the first edition of Pourin Down Rain. Not that I was writing about Pourin Down Rain for film, but it was the catalyst to doing other work. So I was able to share the story of my own connection to John Ware, the Black cowboy who came to Southern Alberta in 1882. And although he died long before I was born, his legacy as a person of African descent in this part of the world, and as a person who also loved horses and who loved this place and who felt rooted and connected here, was very influential. I had the opportunity to share some of that story in a National Film Board documentary, which any Canadian can see on nfb.ca. And I will tell you, if any of you get the opportunity to see the film, that the child in the animation at the beginning and the end of the film is me. It was a gift I gave to myself, placing myself in a magical space where John Ware and I could exist together. And that brings me back to the 30th anniversary edition of Pourin Down Rain. I'm so grateful to Brush Education Press for wanting to republish this book, to allow me to revisit it with new footnotes and some updated material and some new photographs and new cover. It is a testament to how our stories can matter long after we think. It's wonderful that Pouring Down Rain is still alive and still matters and is relevant to our lives today. But it's also a testament to how important it is to keep our stories. And just before I do a quick reading from the book, I would like to encourage you to recognize that your own stories are important. If you have trunks full of photographs or remnants of your grandparents or your parents or your great-grandparents' lives, those are significant. If you have elders still alive, take a tape recorder, or, well, I say a tape recorder because that's what I used 30 years ago. Take your phone and create voice memos, or take cameras, take videos and capture those stories. Our history can only be preserved if we preserve it. So on that note, that's going to be my final request of you, that you recognize how important stories are and that you make the time to listen to the elders and to take down their stories. And I'm going to read a little excerpt from the time that I talked about that I spent with my grandparents in Winnipeg. And you can see in the background of the cover is that same genesis of Pouring Down Rain. Later that evening, my grandmother showed me a photograph of herself taken when she was barely 16 years old. She had the photo done to send to my grandfather, her fiance, who had departed for the First World War effort. She was wearing a white dress and had her hair pulled back with a white flower, a gardenia perhaps, next to her right temple. Her face bore an odd expression. Only her eyes were smiling. Her mouth was almost pouting. It was as though they had a secret or a joke, and she had put the expression on to remind him of it. On the back of the photograph, she had written, "To George Smith, compliment of Arena Glover." That was all. Nothing about loving him or the marriage that they hoped to embark upon if he returned safely. The first time my grandfather saw my grandmother, she was 13 years old. They, along with 100 or more of the Black settlers who lived around Maidstone, Saskatchewan, had gathered to help one of their neighbors in some task on his farm, possibly to raise a barn and, of course, to socialize. It was probably in late fall, after the crops were in, but before the snow came, to force them into isolation from all but their nearest neighbors. My grandmother laughed when the men rose to attend to the work, and my grandfather joined them, taking his hat. "He thinks he's a grown man," she whispered to her mother. She helped to prepare the meal that upon the return of the men, all the people gathered around the large tables to eat. It was 1915. Many of the Black pioneers had now been in Canada for 5 years, some for longer than that, and they had grown accustomed to this way of helping, of leaning heavily upon one another to survive in the strange climate of the country that was less than the promised land they had hoped for. After joining hands and singing grace, they began to laugh and talk and eat the abundance, the ham, the chicken, the roast beef and gravy, the greens, potatoes, peas, carrots, the cornbread, and the fresh, warm bread covered in butter that someone had just pulled from the oven. My grandparents were just two very young people that day. They didn't know that 4 years later, after the war, they would stand together on the banks of the Saskatchewan River in Turtleford County and be married there with these same friends and relatives for witnesses. They did not know, of course, that they would be married for 60 years and raise 9 children, or that 54 years later, she would sit with her granddaughter in a Winnipeg house and remember that day, the day they met. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop the share. And I'm going to ask Natalie to return, and we can see if there are any questions in the chat, or if you haven't had a chance to formulate a question yet, now is your opportunity.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. That was a really, really lovely presentation. And I have to admit that I've grown up in Alberta. I've lived here my entire life, and I didn't know about Amber Valley. I didn't know about those 4 communities. And so I'm really glad that I found out about your book and that I read it. And we've invited you to do a presentation because I've learned a lot and I really appreciate it. So thank you for the work that you've done. And my pleasure. Yeah, it's so much work and appreciate. I'm sure I'm not the only one that has learned a lot. We have a note from Lisa here, and she says, I look forward to reading the book, and thank you for sharing the stories.
Thank you, Lisa. I see earlier that Madison Bridle had sent a note saying that she can see. Madison is my cousin's daughter. Madison is the granddaughter of Sydney and Eileen Smith. Sydney Smith was the late Sydney Smith was one of my mom's brothers. And he was an uncle that was very special to me. And for that reason, I named one of the characters in I Have Been in Danger, Sydney. So hi, Madison. It's great to see you there.
All right. Yeah, feel free to type in any questions that might come through.
If there are no other questions, I do have another reading prepared that I could share, but why don't we, what is your next book? Great question. Thank you, Lisa. I am working on 2 books at the moment. One is another young adult novel that I'm writing with my daughter, Miranda. And I'm not going to share too much about it because I am one of those people that believe you curse a project if you talk about it too far in advance, but we're having a lot of fun. But I'm also working on a book called Mapping Black Calgary, 1880 through 1960, in which I want to share images and literal maps of communities where Black people lived in those years and help people to understand that Black populations have been here for a long time and have made incredible contributions to the city of Calgary. So those are 2 books that I'm working on right now. In terms of Melvin Crump, he was an amazing supporter of my work. You know, as a young person, when you are writing about your elders, that's intimidating. You want them to feel that you are honoring their lives. At the same time, as a writer, you have to be truthful and honest and straightforward, and uh, there's not always a certainty that people are going to appreciate what you're doing. But Mr. Crump was very supportive. He often came out to presentations that I was doing. He often told me he was proud of me. And I also remember my daughter Chandra, my oldest daughter, and my niece Rochelle were featured in a newspaper article talking about Black History Month and the importance of the history to them and about their own lives as university students. And I remember Mr. Crump sent me a check in the mail for each of them as a contribution toward their university career. So I really appreciated him. He was an important elder, and I also really appreciated him as a musician. I thought he was an incredible drummer, and even well into his 80s, as an older man, he was still, I thought, just a really, really precise, incredibly jazzy, great drummer and musician. Thank you for asking about Mr. Crump. See another comment. I'm happy to know that people are excited about reading the books.
The book is available at the White Museum shop. One of the spots is the White Museum shop. We do have it, and we do have an online shop if anyone's interested in buying it through the White Museum.
Well, shall I finish off with another brief reading? You think that would be a good idea?
That would be great.
Okay.
There is another question here from Lisa about plays and if they will be going on tour across Canada.
So Heaven was produced in Edmonton last summer, and we'll have this production in Calgary this summer. My other play, John Ware Reimagined, so it's different from the film John Ware Reclaimed, but my play, John Ware Reimagined, that was first produced in Calgary in 2014, was next produced in Edmonton in 2017. We'll also be having a production in Southern Ontario later this summer, well, at the very end of the summer, throughout the month of September. It would be wonderful if they embarked on a national tour all across the country. And who knows, as I say, you write things and you send them out there into the world, and you don't know if they're going to land. You don't know if someone's going to publish or produce them. And it's very gratifying when you find producers who are interested in the work, but more importantly, you find an audience for the work. It's just a beautiful thing to connect to people in the way that I found books and plays and films connected to me when I was younger.
Thank you.
I'm going to read a little segment about Aunt Daisy. As I said, if it wasn't for her, this book would never have come to life. So I'll read a little bit. When I consider my family's early history in Canada, the year of peat and red, 1916, is my favorite year. Peat and red were the oxen that my grandfather and his brother bought for their parents. Not only did the addition of the ox team return the Smiths to a state of healthy well-being, it allowed Rufus the money and resources to complete the new log house, which he had been building in stages for 5 years. This cabin had 2 bedrooms upstairs and one off the kitchen, which was occupied by the young David and his brothers when they visited home. In the evening, David was likely to warm himself at the black stove that sprawled across the kitchen. Then, carrying the heat with him, he would dash for his bed in the next room. David and his sisters appreciated the luxury of real wood beneath their feet rather than the sod floors that they had endured in the interim cabin. The children, who had at first found the heavily treed countryside around them dense and claustrophobic, now began to appreciate the woods, especially when the summer brought an explosion of fragrance, color, and fat berries. Rufus had bought new horses with the first of Pete and Red's profits, which the Smith children sometimes rode to nearby lakes, or more often, the North Saskatchewan River. Although few Smiths even today are good swimmers, that generation did enjoy fishing and rafting on the boughs of trees that they strapped together. There were two good crops that year, one on Rufus's homestead and one on the section that son John had abandoned after realizing that he preferred expensive clothing and Saskatoon's relative sophistication to life on the farm. The family now raised hogs and kept a few cows, from whose milk Drusilla and her daughters churned butter to sell, along with eggs and the wheat from Rufus's crop. More than once, Aunt Daisy recalled for me in detail how happy they were that autumn as they prepared for the winter ahead. She would hold her hands up in front of my face so that I could imagine how black they became after 2 hours of pulling vegetables from her mother's garden. There were turnips, carrots, beets, potatoes, and cabbage, which her mother transformed into a huge barrel of sauerkraut and stored in the cellar. Some of the eggs she preserved, some of the cream she churned into butter, and with the last load of wheat, she filled the house with loaves of baked bread. After school, the children were sent with buckets into the woods to collect a variety of berries. Drusilla would can or make jam from the Saskatoons, raspberries, strawberries, gooseberries, pin cherries, and other berries that the children gathered. When everything else was ready, Aunt Daisy said when she spoke to me of this happiness, Papa slaughtered 2 of the hogs. Us children felt like we were ready. Old winter could just come on and he wasn't going to bother us none. She rested her head back, paused, closed her eyes. She was recalling herself and her family as they had been in their contentment in 1916, loved, sheltered, and well-fed. Thank you for sharing that comment, Pam, about being inspired and about being a writer. That's one of my greatest joys. I appreciate hearing that. Yes, if you have a desire to write, you have a story. Everyone has a story. And even if you don't want to write your own story, your voice is important. Everyone's voice is unique. So I'm happy to hear that you've been inspired to get some of the stories down. I really hope you continue to do that. A question about advice on how to get started if you're not a writer. Well, the first step, of course, is to make sure the stories are recorded in some way. Even if you just record yourself, sharing the memories that you have. And it's important to find a place, a permanent place to store and keep those things, to make sure that someone knows what they are and where to find them. But just gathering them might inspire you to do your own work around writing the stories down. Don't worry about editing yourself as you go through or thinking, oh, this isn't very good. Nothing is good in first draft. Everything I write in first draft is awful. Trust me, I'm not just saying that. Writers don't spew out a brilliant first draft. We just get it down and then we go back, and it's in the revision that it becomes what we want it to be, or closer to what we want it to be. So don't be daunted by the process of writing.
Well, thank you very much, Cheryl. It looks like those are the questions we have for tonight. But if any more questions come through, feel free to contact me and I can share them, reach out to Cheryl with them. For anyone interested in more programming, we do have, oh, I see another question here. Do you have a writers group you meet with? And that's from Pam.
I have a very small writers group that I meet with that consists of me, my husband, our friend Brian Cooley, and Brian's partner Marianne Wilson, who's not a writer, but she is a visual artist and she draws us as we write. So it's not, it's nothing that anyone would be able to join in on, but it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. Get together with friends, have dinner, have some wine, and read to each other what you're working on. We read each other the bad stuff and then we talk about it and then it gets better and we come back and read it again. I wrote an article about that process actually in the latest edition of Westward, which is the Writers Guild of Alberta magazine. So grab a copy of that magazine. The Writers Guild of Alberta is a fantastic organization to join if you're interested in writing or learning more about how to get your work published. And yes, the most recent edition is a fun piece. I had a lot of fun writing about that process of getting together with Clem and Brian and Marianne and eating good food and writing and talking about writing. I thank you so much, Natalie, for inviting me. And I thank the White Museum of the Rockies and all of you who attended. Thank you so much.
It's our pleasure. Thank you. I will wish everyone a good night and thank you also for joining us.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.